Hi everyone, and welcome now to the third of your introductory videos, and this time we're going to be introducing you to some of the key concepts regarding the social approach. So at the moment you've covered the learning approaches, both behaviourism and social learning theory, and then latterly you've completed the cognitive approach. So now it's time to switch our attention over to the social approach. So please, before we get going, if you have your booklet available to you, a highlighter pen is always a good shout, and you want your booklets open to page 32. So on page 32, what you will see is a copy of the specification for the social approach. Obviously, for each of the approaches, we've always got the key assumptions, so that's going to be the first thing that we start with. And then some of the key concepts that I'm going to cover in this video with you is conformity and some explanations as to why we conform. 3 different types of conformity, because it's not all just one kind. And then latterly, we're going to take a look at social categorization and the fact that that leads to formation of stereotyping. So that's on page 32. We're going to cover those first 3 bullet points in this short video. Okay, so if you turn it over onto page 33 in your booklet, we'll start by taking a look at the key assumptions. So key assumption number 1, and you can highlight this as we go through, is that a social psychologist would propose that behaviour occurs in a social context and that we are heavily influenced by the other people that surround us in those social contexts, and this is often known as social influence. So the people around you, your peers normally, your colleagues, they are all classed as social influences upon you. And there are 3 kind of aspects to this first key approach. So saying that social context affects us. We talk about group pressure, we talk about power and status, and we just talk about social situations being more powerful than your personality. Okay, so just have a quick look over those 3 aspects and see which of the key terms you think goes in which space. Okay. So of the 3 terms on the right-hand side, group pressure is normally what we refer to as conformity. So when we conform, we often behave in ways that we don't necessarily want to or believe it is the right way to behave, but we do so because of group pressure. So maybe highlight the term group pressure and then pop conformity in there. When we're talking about changing behaviour due to power and status of another individual, so basically doing as you are told, that's what we will be calling obedience from this point forward. And then lastly, one of the main things about the social approach is that they argue that it makes no difference whether or not you are the kindest, nicest, most generous person, okay, and that's your disposition. Put in a social context would be enough to change those aspects of personality. And it's something that a lot of students struggle to come to terms with when we first study social psychology, because you're all pretty adamant that you would be the one to break the rule and that you wouldn't be affected by group pressures and you wouldn't be affected by power and status of another individual. But what social psychology research shows us is that for the majority of us, and don't get me wrong, there are some rebels in society, but for the vast majority of us, our personality goes by the wayside and we will engage in behaviours which we don't like doing, that we don't think is the right thing to be doing, but we will do it because of social pressure and social influence around us. So that's a really important thing, that we're not saying that any of these behaviours are reflective of your personality. It's just that you have been changed or affected by the social situation. And as I keep saying, that is called social influence. Okay, so that's key assumption number 1, and we're going to move now on to key assumption number 2. Let's just pop over this a second. I'll come back to that when we get into lesson. So key assumption number 2 is that behaviour, according to social psychologists, can also be understood in terms of wider kind of cultural background. So when we're saying that we are affected by the people around us, that can be more widespread than kind of your group of friends. It can be your cultural experiences of this world and the kind of society that you grew up in. Now, in reference to this key assumption, there are two types of cultural background that you need to be familiar with. These are known as individualistic culture, which is what we belong to in the UK, and you'll see more about that in a moment when you complete the task. And then we've got, as a separate concept, collectivist cultures, okay, which doesn't seem to have that much to do with our kind of society and our cultural background. We're really not a collectivist society in the way that we operate in this country. We're much more individualistic. So at this point, you are going to now find out about the differences between them. All you need to do is access this link, okay? I will provide it to you in your assignment if you're in one of my classes, but for those of you who aren't, it's also included in the description on YouTube. So you need to access it now and put the descriptions, just like a bullet pointed list of what the differences are between individualistic and collectivist cultures, and pop those in on page 33 of your booklets. So pause this video here, go back, access that link, and then come back once you've got those two lists put together. Okay, so moving beyond the key assumptions now, we're going to go into our first of the key concepts. So the first key concept, which you've actually been introduced to already as part of the SIL, is conformity. So because I think you might already be familiar with this, just take a look at the words that I've presented to you on the screen. Again, maybe pause me and shut me up for a second and see if you can rearrange those terms into a definition of what you think conformity is. So press pause, see if you can form the sentence. And is this what you got? So conformity is defined as a change, so that's really important, you want to underline that word, a change in a person's behaviour, can also be beliefs as well, due to, underline this for me, real in some cases, or in most cases, imagined pressure. So in a lot of social situations, there is nobody actually goading you. There's no real pressure, but you imagine that pressure from other people in the group. And that's enough or powerful enough to change our behaviour and also our beliefs. So that's the definition, but we do need to provide a couple of examples as well. So have you ever done any of the following? So you see a new film with your mates at the cinema and you don't think it's very good, but because everybody else raves about it, you actually agree with them and say that you thought it was good. Your friends all buy a cake from Starbucks as a treat. You're really trying to be healthy at the moment, but you don't want to be the odd one out, so you have a cake too. In a multiple choice quiz in class, and I see this all the time, everybody else is showing option C on their whiteboard. You thought it was B, but you go along with C anyway. And then your train arrives at an unfamiliar train station, you get off the train and you follow the crowd of people who have also left the train, okay? So have you done any of those? You can pop any of those into the example space on page 34, or if you think you can come up with an example of your own, then feel free to write that in there as well. So again, pause this, fill in that box and then return. Now, the concept of conformity, I've already said to you, should be familiar at this point because it was part of the SIL. But in case you can't remember, this was first investigated by a guy called Solomon Asch in the early 1950s. So it's been around a long time. And the task should kind of bring back some recollection. So most of the participants in the Asch study, so 6 of them in total, were Confederates who were told to give an incorrect answer to a very, very obvious, or what we would call non-ambiguous task. The task was to match the test card line to the standard card line. So the real participant, who we call the naive participant in the Asch study, would tend to go with the incorrect answers that the Confederates were presenting. So even though the obvious right answer to this example is test card line number 1, If the Confederates had all said that it was number 2, then the real participant would conform and they would give an answer that was incorrect. But after they were debriefed and they were questioned as to why they behaved in that manner, the vast majority of the participants said they knew that it was the wrong answer, but they didn't want to be ridiculed by saying a different answer to everyone else, okay? So that really got Solomon Asch thinking, what are the reasons for conformity? Why are we doing it on most occasions? And the most common reason is because we don't want to look stupid. We don't want to kind of stand out. We want to be ordinary. We want to be the same as everyone else, and we don't want to be ridiculed for being different in any way. And that is a very, very common experience, all right? Very part of common human experience, that we want to just kind of fit in. So off the basis of Asch's work in the mid-1950s, we get a model presented to us, and you can see it in your booklets, highlight it for me, called the dual process theory. So Dutch and Gerard took Solomon Asch's original ideas or original findings, and they tried to offer an explanation as to why we conform. Again, can you please highlight that term, because this material is separate to what we're going to look at in a few moments, which is the types of conformity. So this is called the dual process theory, and this is offering an explanation as to why we feel compelled to conform in certain social situations. So above the table on page 34, I'm just going to very briefly introduce you to these two terms: normative social influence and informational social influence. Please, at this point, don't write anything into those boxes, because otherwise you'll run out of space in a few moments when we get on to the next task. So this is just helping you understand what those two terms mean. You can add on notes above the table, but not actually in the spaces. So normative social influence, and you can abbreviate it to NSI if you want to, is all to do with group norms. So we behave in ways that we think are typical or normal, and they tend to guide society and they bond us together because there are a set of unwritten or invisible group norms that the vast majority of society tend to adhere to. So this is normative social influence. This is the pressure to conform because you think that what everybody else is doing is the norm, okay? And this is a very powerful influence over us, and a lot of us will be affected by normative social influence on a daily occurrence, okay? So we're just conforming to others to fit in, basically, and not be the odd one out, and that's just group norms that are driving us. So like I said, only above the table to begin with. Informational social influence is slightly different. This is where we doubt ourselves and we copy other people in a group because we think that they are right, okay? So think of your own behaviours. When have you done this? When have you copied the behaviour of someone else because you presumed that they were right and you were wrong? For example, we still have to go on training as teachers, and I went to a training course last year, so quite recently, and it was an aspect of my teaching that I'd not really done much training on, so it was some kind of behaviour management course. And I sat in that course and I felt that everybody else in there was much more qualified than me, okay, because I'd never done anything like it before. And what I ended up doing was following the rest of the group's answers and responses, and I ended up sharing their beliefs and their opinions and going along with them simply because I thought what they were saying was right, because I didn't know what I was supposed to be saying. So I sought them as kind of guidance, and I believed that what they were saying was truthful, okay? So now what we're going to do after we've had those brief introductions is we're going to attempt to fill up this box. So there's quite a lot that we need to get in here, because when we're describing the dual process model, remember that's the name of this theory, there's quite a lot of terminology and key ideas that you have to be able to put across for your Unit 1 exam. So we're going to work through these from left to right, and we're going to see whether or not you think they belong with normative social influence, which is fitting in and group norms, or informational social influence, which is believing that other people are right. Now, I wouldn't recommend writing these in as we go along. Instead, we'll go through them all, we'll reveal the right answers, and then pause it and have it up on the screen, and you can fill in those two boxes side by side. So if you do this with me, hopefully it should be obvious where it's going. So the first one, we want to avoid social rejection, would be normative social influence, because it's about acceptance, okay? So we want to avoid social rejection. The next one, again, hopefully should be obvious, is the desire to be right. So that would be informational social influence. You copy other people because you think they are correct. The next one along, likely to lead to a long-lasting change in behaviour. Now, this is informational social influence. When you believe that other people are right and you are wrong and they know what they're supposed to be doing, you often adopt or change to their belief processes, okay? So that can often result in long-lasting changes in behaviour because you really do think it's correct. Next one down, the desire to be liked. Again, normative social influence. And you can probably see the theme here. If the next one along is unlikely to lead to long-lasting change in behaviour, then that now should be obvious that that's NSI. Next one, we are unsure about behaviour and if it's right or wrong. That again, because it's making reference to not knowing whether or not you are right or wrong, is informational social influence. If you don't know the correct way to respond, then you're more likely to go along with other people. Next one, we believe that others have better information than we do. Also informational social influence because it's about seeking information or guidance. We want others to accept and like us is normative. A cognitive process because it is about what you think. So this is informational social influence because you're questioning what you know. So it's about what you think. The one underneath it, I'll give it away to you straight away, is normative. So informational is thinking, normative is just feeling. It's about avoiding rejection and about feeling emotionally stable in a group of people. So bottom left-hand corner, is more likely to happen in a stressful situation where people have a greater need for social support is normative. So normative social influence tends to occur in peer pressure situations. And then lastly, more likely to happen in ambiguous situations like I was describing before. You go into a new class or to a new job. So there's no clear right or wrong answer and you assume that the other people present are experts in some way. So that's informational social influence, and we've already done that bottom one. Normative is about how you feel. So pause this video again now, get those divided, pop those into the table on page 34. And then we're going to skip over page 35 because your teacher will do that with you to check that you understood the concepts. So when you come back, we're going to be on page 36. Okay, so now we're going to move away then from the dual process model, which is explaining why we conform, to now slightly easier, the different types of conformity. So we're on page 36. So to begin with the types of conformity, I'm going to provide you with a very, very basic definition or basic description of compliance, identification, and internalisation. I've said here, you can see this goes into the very left-hand column in your table and goes underneath where it says those key terms. So let's write these in to begin with, okay? We've got compliance, identification, and internalisation. And you can also see that on the right-hand side of your page, there is an arrow to indicate that these go from very shallow levels of conformity, okay, to very deep levels of conformity. So compliance, going in that very left-hand column, is to change your public behaviour to that of a group without changing your true opinions. So it is the shallowest type of conformity, and it's the one that we all do the most. So you just go along with something, okay? It's a very public form of conformity. So to be compliant is to publicly conform without actually really believing in what you're doing. Identification is changing your public behaviour and your beliefs, but only while you're in the presence of the group. So this is about wanting to identify or be part of a particular group. And then latterly, the deepest type of conformity is internalisation, where your public and your private beliefs genuinely start to change. So that's what we say is it's a deep type of conformity. So what are we going to put then into that right-hand column? And you can see it's entitled description. And again, as with the dual process model, to explain why, there's quite a lot that we've got to get in there, okay? We need some good key descriptors. So let's go ahead, and again we've got a sorting task here, and sort them out into compliance, identification and internalisation. I've put on the right hand side as well, and you might want to pop this somewhere on page 36 as a bit of a key tip, that when you are asked to outline any one type of conformity in the exam, you can refer to three things. I call them the 3 Ps. It'd be really good if I could see that in some of your booklets. So these are the 3 Ps, and what I mean by that is whether the change is public or private, whether the change is permanent, okay, and then obviously just the level of conformity. So your 3 Ps are public, private, permanent, okay. So let's see if we can start to sort these out. So public agreement and some private agreement because you value the group's opinions. So I've already said to you that one of those types of conformity is about belonging and the want to belong. So this one, a public agreement because you value the other people's opinions, is identification. Again, I probably wouldn't write these in as we're going through, instead pause it when we get to the end. The next one along, moderate level of conformity, is also identification. The shallowest level of conformity, should be obvious, is compliance. Next one, but in the corner left, desire to avoid group pressures because we don't want to stand out. Now that's really shallow, okay, it's really superficial, all right, but we do that because we want to be the same as everybody else. Now the next one along, always leads to a permanent change. This can only be internalisation. The other two, okay, types of conformity can sometimes lead to a permanent change. So sometimes if you're deeply embedded into a group, like a gang or something, that can sometimes change your beliefs on a permanent basis. But most of the time, it's internalisation that can lead to a permanent change all the time. Next one along, a desire to be accepted as a member of a group is again identification. Deepest level of conformity, internalisation. A public agreement, so you're doing something publicly, but privately you're inside, you're screaming like, why am I doing this? Like laughing at a joke that's really inappropriate and you really don't find funny, but you're doing it out loud, would be compliance. Have you ever done that? Okay, laughed at a joke that really you don't agree with or you don't understand, but you still laugh along. The desire to adopt a new belief system is internalisation, okay? So this stems from the fact that you really kind of don't know how to react or respond in the company of this particular group of people. So you want a new belief system and therefore you're more likely to internalise it. Next one, the agreement stops as soon as the majority influence is removed. It is not permanent. So that should clearly be compliance. So with my example of laughing at a joke that you don't find funny, as soon as that group goes away, you still don't find the joke funny. All right. So you're only laughing when you're in the presence of that group. The change in behaviour is usually short term, only whilst with the group. So that's identification. Again, it comes from the desperate need to just be part of that group and be the same as them, for them to accept you into the fold. All right. So if it was a new group of students that you wanted to be included with at college, for example, you might change your behaviour whilst you're with them because you want to be part of that kind of gang, whatever. I hate that word, but you're identifying with them, but you're only doing it whilst you're with them. And it's because you want them to like you or admire you, okay? And then last one, private and public agreement is internalisation. Excuse me. So again, pause this now and take a moment to fill in your booklets. We are going to do a task on the screen in terms of you trying to identify what type of conformity excuse me, it is. But please leave the table on page 37 blank, because that will be a task that your teacher does with you in class. So pause here, fill that in, and then come back and we'll do a little task on the screen. Okay. So with those descriptions in front of you on page 36, you can do this with me. What do you think the types of conformity are on examples 1 to 7? So pause it, have a read through them, see if you can sort them out, maybe write them down and then tick them off when I go through the right answers in a second. So pause here, please. Okay. So number 1 would be internalisation, becoming a lifelong supporter. So it's a permanent change. Number 2 is also internalisation, because you've changed your eating habits, so becoming a vegetarian for the rest of your life. Number 3, identification, joining a club, okay? You're not interested, you just want to be accepted into that group, so you go along with them, okay? Number 4, compliance, saying that you love a song when really you think it's rubbish. Number 5, identification, joining the army. It's about group identity, okay? As soon as you leave the army, you leave those ways of thinking behind. Next, compliance. We've already referenced this one, laughing at a joke that you don't understand. And then lastly, Pravinder is identification. It's similar to the army example. You join the police, you adhere to their group belief systems whilst you're in that group. Then when you're off duty, those values or beliefs and behaviours start to change. So that, guys, is the introduction there to what conformity is generally, the dual process model, which is an explanation as to why we conform, so normative and informational social influence, and then latterly the 3 types of conformity. So obviously before your lesson, go back to that material and double check it. But at this point now, we're going to move away from conformity and onto our second key concept, which is on page 38, and this is in and out groups. So if you're ready, let's continue. So I've said this is key concept number 2. We're moving away from conformity. And this now is moving into a new theory called social identity theory. So you can highlight this. This was put together much later than all the kind of conformity theories. So this was in the mid-1970s, and then a lot of work on this in the 1980s, and was put forward by a psychologist called Henry Tajfel. And he suggested that social identity, if you want to highlight this, is a person's sense of who they are, but it is based almost entirely on the groups that they belong to. So this is called group membership. And without any group membership, you struggle with your self-esteem. So you don't really know who you are. You have kind of no sense of identity, no sense of purpose. So they definitely give us a sense of belonging in the world. So this is social identity. So the first thing that I'd like you to have a go at doing for me, on the top of page 38 in that box provided, is list some of the groups that you belong to, which help you kind of reason with your identity. So who are you? What are all the things that you do, or all the groups that you belong to that form you? So I've given you some examples for myself. So some identities that I hold are my political preferences, the fact that I'm a mum, the fact that I'm a teacher, and the fact that I'm a graduate. They are all social groups, okay, that I belong to, that give me some sort of sense of who I am, and they help build my self-esteem. Knowing that I belong to those groups and knowing what I should be like, essentially, is really helpful in having a firm sense of belonging, okay? So you try to do that for me now. What are the groups that you belong to in this world that allow you to know who you are? Pause this here and make that little list, hopefully. Now, the premise behind social identity theory is not just that it gives us a sense of who we are, but we also refer to this idea that belonging to those groups allows us to divide the world around us into what we call in and out groups, or them and us groups. Now, this is called social categorization. And again, a lot of students don't like to admit that you go through this process, but it's human nature to inevitably do this. So to experience social categorization is when we place people into social groups and we use this to just distinguish people against one another. Notice it says distinguish, not discriminate, okay? So, but people belonging to certain social groups just allows us to identify potentially who they are, what some of their values are, and how we would interact with them. So go ahead and write that into the very large space that we've given you on page 38, social categorization. And as you can see, I've already said that this helps us divide the world into almost a them and us mentality. The problem is the way that we attribute the them and us mentality, okay? So via social categorization, we often wrongfully assume that anybody who does not belong to the same social categories as us is completely different to us, okay? We often believe that our in-group is superior to other people who don't belong in that group, okay? So we assume that everybody who is in our in-group, we all have the same values, we all have the same identity. But we then use that and exaggerate anybody who doesn't belong in there. So anybody who is in the out group can't possibly be in any way, shape or form the same as us, okay? So we divide ourselves into these in and out groups, them versus us, and we wrongfully assume sometimes that everybody who is in our group, the in group, all has a shared value system, and anybody in the out group can't possibly be the same as us. And what that often results in, most of the time it's harmless, but what that often results in is a superiority complex where we pick out negative aspects of an outgroup and we focus on them, thereby enhancing our own self-image. We think that we are better than anybody who doesn't belong in our group. So anybody in the outgroup is inferior to us. Like I say, us versus them, social categorization, in versus out groups is often harmless. It just allows us to recognize what social groups people belong to. But sometimes it can result in these kind of divides and discrimination. So if you turn over onto the top of page 39, I've listed some examples for you of social categorization or in-group, out-group, which has unfortunately had very negative consequences because the people who belong to these groups cannot see any common ground and they cannot see any similarities. So we've got in Northern Ireland, Catholics versus Protestants. In Rwanda, an African nation, the Hutus versus the Tutsis, which was the second worst act of genocide after the Holocaust. Yugoslavia, also a genocidal act between the Bosnians and the Serbs. We've got in Germany, Jews and the Nazis. In politics, okay, some of you might be familiar with this, Labour and Conservatives. In football, Liverpool and Man United teams. In gender, males versus females. And in social class, middle versus the working classes. So they are all where people belong to one or the other rather. So they're either in group or the out group. And they wrongly think that everybody in that group has everything in common, and anybody who doesn't belong to it, they can't possibly have anything in common with them. They can't share anything at all. So I've given you that list. Can you now pause this and come up with some more examples of your own? Mine are quite historical examples, with the exception, I think, of kind of the gender, social class maybe, and football. But can you come up with any more modern examples that we can talk about in class where you do think there is definitely an in-group, out-group mentality? I'll be interested to see what you put in there. So pop any more examples that you can come up with. So now we've got some idea of what I mean by social categorization, okay? And this idea that we see the world very much on a them versus us, in-group, out-group basis. We're now going to take that one step further and we're going to have a look at the impact of social categorization. So this is just a handful more minutes, guys, talking about the effects really of social categorization. And one effect of social categorization, and you might have already seen this coming, is that it can often lead to stereotyping. Because you are making snap judgments about what group a person belongs to, this can very much lead us into stereotyping. And again, if you have ever stereotyped a person, please don't feel bad about that. It's very much kind of deep rooted into the human experience, that it's helpful for us to divide people, and it's helpful for us to have kind of a preconceived idea of what we think that person is going to be. It's just that sometimes it can go wrong. So stereotyping, write this definition in now, please, on page 39. Is a fixed, overgeneralized view of a person based on their perceived, that's a really important word for you there to highlight, membership of a social category. And that's where the damage happens, because you perceive or assume that somebody belongs to a specific social category, and that's where the wrongful stereotyping can often creep in, okay? So in order to demonstrate this, we're going to think about some kind of stereotypes that are held. I've tried to steer clear of anything controversial, okay? But we're going to have a think about what we wrongfully assume about these social groups of people. So onto the bottom of page 39, I would like you to form some lists in terms of the stereotypical views of male behaviour versus female behaviour. So biological males, biological females, or if you want to just go masculine, feminine, okay, what are the stereotypical behaviours that we associate with a male identity and a female identity, okay? So be honest, okay? You got to be honest and say that this is kind of what happens in society. Even if you don't hold these stereotypical views yourself, I am sure you will be aware of what stereotypes exist about these people. So pause this here. List of stereotypical beliefs about male gendered behaviour and list of stereotypical things for female gendered behaviour. Okay. So, did you agree with my little list? Okay, you can add any of these on that you haven't got, or if you've got more than what I got. So I've said for females, they're caring, emotional, maybe flirty, passive, quite smart, loving, happy, gossiping, helpful, and kind. For males, I've gone for strong, loud, aggressive, confident, arrogant, dumb, stubborn, assertive, proud, and dominant, okay? So both of those lists contain, I would say, positive and negative attributes or qualities, okay? I think there's more negative attributes in the male column. Is that the same as you? Did you have more negative attributes put in the male column, or did you have more negative attributes for the female column? Again, that will just show you about what stereotypical views you hold of these groups of people in society. So let's move it on and let's do one more. Now have a go at the stereotypical views for Americans and British. Again, pause it here and we'll see if they match up with mine. Okay, so my list. Americans are all baseball cap wearing rather. Wear trainers, obsessed with guns, materialistic, don't have cultural awareness, so of other nations in the world. They're racist, they're arrogant, they have a respect for the military, they are extremely patriotic, they are workaholics, they are always optimistic, and they are largely generous. Whereas British are posh, rich, arrogant, snobs, go to private school, white, highly motivated, study constantly, have no social life, so don't exercise or have any hobbies, and wear gowns. So, like I say, they may not be your views, but I think if you went and asked a typical American person what British people are, you would get some of those. And if you asked a typical British person what Americans are, you would get some of those. So this is the idea that social categorization, thinking in terms of us versus them or in versus out mentality, leads to stereotyping. Okay. And like I say, it's not a shameful thing to admit if you stereotype. It's very much what most people do. Okay. So where do stereotypes come from? They don't just develop overnight, okay? And more often than not, and you can see this in your book, so highlight it please, they develop from what we call a grain of truth, okay? There does, for most stereotypical beliefs, appear to be at least one aspect of that stereotype that bears some sort of truthful existence. So they begin with a grain of truth. And then there are two further sources of information which build the stereotypes. And these are called personal experience and gatekeepers, okay? So you can see that in your booklet there. So all stereotypes start with a little grain of truth, and then they build over time either through personal experience or through gatekeeping. So let's take a look at personal experience first, and I've gone with the stereotypical view that Chinese people are good at math. Okay, where does that come from? Okay, where does this belief come from that all Chinese people are good at maths? So there might be a grain of truth in it, and that might have come from personal experience. So there might have been one Chinese classmate always scoring highly in maths, and that could feed in to that original stereotype. Furthermore, it might be, that idea might be gatekept in the media. So the gatekeepers that we refer to usually are parents, friends who keep transmitting the stereotype, but also the media is usually to blame, okay? So how have the media been gatekeeping this particular stereotype? So in American TV and movies, actors from Chinese backgrounds may often play roles as computer engineers or scientists. Can you think of any films where that has happened? Where we've got a person of Chinese origin or Asian origin, usually, playing somebody in one of those kinds of roles, and that just exaggerates the stereotype. So it starts with a grain of truth. Yes, Chinese people might be good at maths, but then they build through either personal experience, okay, of certain individuals, or that the notion is being gatekept, or there are gatekeepers keeping this particular stereotype going. So to finish off, for the final task of this introductory lesson, I'd like you to try and explain how personal experience and gatekeepers could have helped form one of these stereotypes. If you want to come up with a different one of your own, then that's absolutely fine. But I've gone with blondes, millennials, so I'd be interested to see if any of you tackle that one, all right, and tell me what you think of millennials, me being one, and then police. But if you want to come up with a more interesting one, then that's absolutely fine. So as always, guys, I hope you've found this video interesting and helpful, and this will now give you some very good basic knowledge to go in to your lessons and be tested further by your teacher. Okay, bye for now.